Trash belongs in economy, not first class. The sentence landed harder than the turbulence outside the aircraft. It didn't sound like a joke. It didn't sound accidental. It sounded practiced. Deliberate. Like something flight attendant Claire Whitmore had said before. The first-class cabin of Horizon Atlantic Flight 221 fell into the kind of silence money usually prevents. Crystal glasses paused halfway to lips. Fingers stopped scrolling across phone screens. Even the soft jazz floating through the overhead speaker suddenly felt too quiet for the moment hanging in the air. Naomi Carter looked up slowly from the leather seat marked 2A. She didn't react the way Claire expected. No outrage. No raised voice. No scene. Used to calm pair of dark eyes lifting toward the blonde flight attendant standing over her with crossed arms and a smile sharp enough to cut through steel. Naomi sat still beneath the warm amber cabin lights wearing a charcoal gray sweater, black jeans, and worn white sneakers that looked almost invisible against the cream-colored carpet. No jewelry. No designer logos. No bodyguards. Nothing about her appearance screamed billionaire. That was intentional. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. This story sparked change. And we're glad you're here. Now, back to Naomi Carter. Clyde tilted her head slightly, pretending to check the boarding pass in her hand for a second time. You sure this is your seat? She asked loudly enough for 3 nearby rows to hear. A white couple across the aisle exchanged glances. The husband leaned closer to his wife and whispered something that made her lips tighten. Naomi answered quietly. That's what the ticket says. Clyde gave a short laugh under her breath. Funny how people suddenly end up in first class these days. The words drifted across the cabin like smoke. Ugly enough to notice. Polite enough to deny later. Naomi folded her hands calmly in her lap. She had seen this look before. The suspicion hidden behind customer service smiles. The quick visual math people did when they saw a black woman in an expensive place without diamonds hanging from her wrists. 22 years earlier, Naomi had stood in another airport wearing a clearance rack blazer and holding a boarding pass to New York for the first investor meeting of her life. A gate agent had looked at her ticket, then looked at her skin, then asked if she was lost. She remembered every second of that humiliation. Not because it broke her. Because it sharpened her. Now, at 42 years old, Naomi Carter owned more private aviation stock than most people could comprehend. Her logistics company moved nearly 11% of all overnight medical freight across the United States. Business magazines called her one of the most powerful women in transportation. But none of that mattered to Claire Whitmore in first-class seat 2A. To Clyde, Naomi was just another black passenger who didn't look premium. The aircraft doors were still open as boarding continued. A man in a navy business suit stopped in the aisle behind Claire and frowned impatiently. Problem up here? He asked. Clyde smiled without turning around. Just sorting out a seating issue. Naomi noticed how Claire chose that word carefully. Seating issue. Not passenger. Not misunderstanding. Issue. Human beings became easier to mistreat once they sounded like problems. The businessman looked directly at Naomi's clothes before nodding slowly like the answer suddenly made sense. Ah, he muttered. Naomi caught it. So did the young Latina woman sitting 2 rows ahead, who immediately lowered her phone and stared back toward first class with concern growing across her face. Clyde handed the boarding pass back with 2 fingers, like touching it too long might stain her manicure. I can help you find economy if you're confused. Naomi took the ticket slowly. I'm not confused. Clyde's smile faded. Used slightly. Then maybe don't make this difficult. The engine outside hummed louder as baggage handlers moved beneath the wing. Rain tapped softly against the oval windows. Somewhere farther back in the cabin, a baby cried briefly before being soothed. Life continued normally for everyone except the woman in seat 2A. Naomi crossed one leg over the other and looked out the window at the storm rolling across the runway lights. She could feel the eyes on her now. So curious. So uncomfortable. So quietly agreeing with Claire. That was the thing about prejudice in luxury spaces. It rarely announced itself loudly at first. It entered the room dressed as policy. As suspicion. As double-checking. Claire leaned closer, lowering her voice this time. People like you always make scenes when they get caught. There it was. The real sentence beneath all the polished airline language. People like you. Naomi turned her head back slowly. Her face stayed calm, but something colder entered her eyes. Across the aisle, the white woman from earlier stopped pretending not to listen. A man near the window removed one AirPod completely. The cabin could feel tension building the same way people sensed lightning before thunder arrived. Naomi spoke softly enough that Claire had to lean in to hear her. Run the seat number again. Claire let out a breath through her nose, already irritated by Naomi's composure. She expected defensiveness. Maybe embarrassment. Instead she got stillness. And stillness unsettled people who depended on intimidation. Ma'am, Claire said, voice tightening, first-class passengers cooperate with crew instructions. Naomi looked directly at her. Then maybe treat me like one. A long silence followed. Not empty silence. Heavy silence. The kind that slowly forces everyone nearby to choose a side whether they want to or not. Claire straightened immediately, embarrassed that the exchange hadn't gone the way she planned. She glanced around the cabin and noticed people watching now. Really watching. Her cheeks reddened slightly beneath her makeup. Unbelievable, she muttered before turning toward the galley. But just before walking away, she looked back over her shoulder one last time and said the word that would change the entire flight. Trash. The cabin froze. The word hung in the first-class cabin long after Claire Whitmore disappeared behind the galley curtain. Nobody moved right away. Nobody spoke. It was the kind of silence that exposed people. The kind that forced strangers to decide whether they had just witnessed something ugly or whether they were willing to pretend nothing happened at all. Naomi Carter remained seated in 2A with one hand resting lightly against the armrest, her expression unreadable beneath the warm cabin lights. Outside the rain intensified against the aircraft windows, streaking silver lines across the darkening evening sky over Chicago ORA. A flight attendant farther back forced an artificial smile while helping another passenger with luggage, but the energy inside first class had shifted completely. The white businessman standing in the aisle cleared his throat awkwardly and moved toward row 3 without looking directly at Naomi again. Across from her, the woman with pearl earrings suddenly became fascinated with the wine menu in her lap. People always did that after moments like this. They looked away from discomfort as if silence erased responsibility. Naomi had spent most of her life watching that happen. A soft chime echoed overhead as more passengers boarded the aircraft. Naomi adjusted the sleeve of her gray sweater and glanced down briefly at the boarding pass still resting in her hand. Seat 2A. Confirmed. But in full 3 weeks earlier under her legal name. Naomi Carter. Nothing hidden. Nothing fake. Yet somehow still unbelievable to people like Claire. A young black man wearing headphones stopped briefly near the first-class curtain while waiting for traffic to clear in the aisle. His eyes moved from Naomi to the tension frozen around the cabin. He understood immediately. Naomi could see it in his face. He did not ask questions. He simply gave her a small nod before continuing toward economy. That quiet acknowledgement hit harder than sympathy ever could. The Latina woman 2 rows ahead slowly turned around in her seat. She looked about 25, maybe younger, with dark curls pulled into a loose bun and a phone resting carefully against her thigh. She had recorded at least part of the exchange. Naomi noticed the screen still glowing. Their eyes met for half a second. The woman looked embarrassed for watching but also angry for what she had seen. Naomi gave the smallest possible shake of her head. Not yet. Do not turn this into a spectacle. The woman lowered the phone immediately. Near the galley, Claire reappeared carrying a silver tray of pre-departure drinks. Her posture had changed. Sharper now. More defensive. She walked through first class offering champagne to passengers with polished smiles until she reached Naomi's row. Then the smile vanished. Would you like anything? Clyde asked flatly. Naomi looked up. Water is fine. Clyde stared for one beat too long before handing her the smallest bottle on the tray while everyone else received crystal glasses. Teeny details. Teeny humiliations. That was how people like Claire operated. Not loudly enough for complaints. Used enough to remind someone they were unwelcome. Naomi accepted the bottle calmly. Thank you. Clyde blinked slightly at the politeness. It disrupted the story she had already created in her head. Difficult passenger. Aggressive passenger. Problem passenger. Can this ruin prejudice because it removed the excuse people relied on? Clyde moved on quickly. The older white man in row 1 leaned toward his wife after she left. Something feels off here, he whispered. His wife nodded without answering. 2 seats behind Naomi, a teenager traveling with his mother quietly asked, why was she talking to that lady like that? His mother lowered her voice instantly. Do not stare. But Naomi heard it anyway. Everyone heard it. The cabin had become one giant held breath. Naomi twisted the cap of the water bottle slowly and took a sip. Her phone vibrated once against the seat beside her. A secure message flashed across the screen from her executive assistant, Renee Lawson. Wheels up in 40 minutes. Board review scheduled tomorrow at 9. Naomi typed back only 4 words. Delay the review meeting. 3 dots appeared immediately. Everything okay? Naomi looked toward the galley where Claire was laughing quietly with another flight attendant while glancing in Naomi's direction. Then she typed, I may have found the problem. Renee did not reply with questions. She never did. That was why Naomi trusted her with a multi-billion-dollar operation spanning 3 continents. 20 years. Earlier, when Naomi built her first freight routing company out of a rented warehouse outside Atlanta, she learned quickly that success depended less on intelligence and more on observation. Most executives ignored small humiliations because they never experienced them. Naomi noticed everything. The tone in a voice. The hesitation before respect. The way luxury spaces became colder when certain people walked in. Horizon Atlantic Airlines had recently posted record profits after its merger deal. Investors celebrated. Headlines praised leadership. But customer complaints buried deep inside internal reports kept repeating the same phrases. Targeted. Humiliated. Profiled. Naomi had boarded Flight 221 tonight for one reason only. She wanted to see the culture herself before finalizing the acquisition vote next month. She just had not expected the answer to arrive within 5 minutes of boarding. Clyde returned again, this time beside a tall male purser named Daniel Mercer whose silver wings reflected beneath the cabin lights. Latte fortis. Perfect posture. Expensive watch. The type of man who sounded trustworthy before he said anything at all. Naomi recognized the archetype instantly. Daniel stopped beside seat 2A and offered a measured corporate smile. Good evening, ma'am. Clyde mentioned there may have been some confusion regarding seating. There it was again. Confusion. Another polished word covering something rotten underneath. Naomi folded her hands together. There was no confusion. Daniel nodded slowly but did not actually listen. Of course. We simply want to ensure every passenger is comfortable. Clyde stood behind him with her arms crossed, watching Naomi carefully now. Waiting for attitude. Waiting for anger. waiting for proof she belonged exactly where Claire believed she did. Naomi looked directly at Daniel. Then perhaps you should start with your crew. The sentence landed softly. Calmly. But several nearby passengers lifted their heads immediately. Daniel's smile tightened almost invisibly. Clyde looked offended. Good. For the first time since boarding, discomfort was no longer sitting only in seat 2A. Daniel Mercer kept the corporate smile on his face for exactly 3 more seconds after Naomi spoke. Then it faded just enough for the truth underneath to show. Not anger. Not yet. Irritation. The irritation of a man unused to being challenged in his own cabin. Around them, passengers pretended to focus on magazines, drinks, and glowing phone screens, but nobody was truly distracted anymore. First class had stopped functioning like a luxury cabin and started functioning like a courtroom. Every glance mattered. Every word carried weight. Daniel rested one hand lightly against the top of Naomi's seat. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "my crew follows policy to ensure passenger safety and comfort." Naomi held his gaze. "Interesting policy." Clyde let out a quiet scoff behind him. "You still have not explained why your boarding information caused an issue." Naomi looked down briefly at the boarding pass still resting beside her untouched water bottle. "Because there was never an issue with the boarding information." Clyde folded her arms tighter. "Then why did the system flag your seat?" A flicker crossed Daniel's face immediately. Teeny. Fast. But Naomi saw it. Clyde had just revealed something she should not have revealed. Daniel turned slightly toward her. "Clyde." But she kept going. "We have protocols for situations like this." The businessman in row 3 finally spoke up. "She has been sitting there the whole time." "What exactly is the situation?" Clyde straightened instantly, grateful for support. "Sir, we are handling it." Naomi noticed how quickly Claire relaxed once another white passenger entered the conversation. That confidence shift was familiar too. Daniel lowered his voice slightly. "Perhaps we can review your boarding credentials one more time." Naomi looked at him calmly. "You already reviewed them. And we simply want to verify everything is accurate." "Again." Daniel nodded once. Naomi studied him for a long second before handing over her identification without protest. A black American Express Centurion card slid out accidentally beneath the identification card as she moved her wallet. Clyde's eyes dropped immediately to the metal card. So did Daniel's. The energy shifted for half a heartbeat. Belt was finally visible now. Tangible. Recognizable. Clyde recovered first. "Cards can be borrowed." There it was again. The desperate need to preserve the assumption even after evidence appeared. Naomi almost smiled at how predictable prejudice became once challenged. Daniel examined the identification carefully. Naomi Carter. The name clearly meant nothing to him. That surprised her slightly. Then again, most executives inside transportation knew her face from magazine covers and boardrooms, not from quiet cabins and sweaters without labels. Claire leaned closer toward Daniel and whispered something low enough that only he could hear. But Naomi caught 2 words anyway. "Not believable." Daniel handed the identification back slowly. "Miss Carter, we are simply trying to avoid misunderstandings before departure." Naomi accepted the card. "The misunderstanding happened the moment your employee called me trash." Silence hit the cabin again. Sharp this time. Direct. No more vague language hiding what happened. Daniel's jaw tightened almost invisibly. Clyde immediately crossed into defense mode. "I did not call you that." Naomi looked directly at her. "You did." "That is not what I meant." "Then what did you mean?" Clyde opened her mouth but nothing came out immediately. The passengers nearby noticed. The teenager 2 rows back lowered his headphones again. The Latina woman with the phone quietly pressed record without raising the device. Daniel stepped in quickly. Let us de-escalate the tone here. Naomi turned toward him slowly. Interesting choice of words. I have not raised my voice once. That landed harder than shouting ever could have. Across the aisle, the older white woman finally looked directly at Naomi for the first time since boarding. There was shame in her expression now. Not because she caused the moment. Because she recognized it. Daniel adjusted his jacket cuff carefully, buying himself time. No one is accusing you of wrongdoing. Clyde muttered under her breath, not yet. Naomi heard it. So did the businessman in row 3, whose expression immediately changed from annoyance to discomfort. A younger flight attendant emerged from the galley carrying folded blankets before stopping short after sensing the tension. She looked no older than 26 with a neat braid and nervous eyes. Her name tag read Melissa Chin. Melissa glanced from Claire to Naomi and instantly understood something was wrong. Everything okay up here? She asked carefully. Clyde answered without even looking at her. Yes. Melissa hesitated. Because the gate scanner already cleared seat 2A during boarding. Clyde turned sharply. Melissa. The younger attendant froze. Daniel stepped in smoothly before the moment could continue. Thank you, Melissa. We have it handled. But the damage was already done. Several passengers looked up immediately after hearing that. Cleared during boarding. Naomi noticed Claire's posture stiffen. Teeny cracks were forming now. The businessman in row 3 spoke again. So if her ticket scanned correctly, why are we still discussing this? Clyde forced a smile that looked painful around the edges. Sir, premium cabins require additional discretion. Naomi tilted her head slightly. Discretion from whom? Clyde did not answer. Because there was no safe answer left. The cabin lights dimmed briefly as boarding neared completion. Rain continued tapping softly against the windows while thunder rolled somewhere beyond the runway. Naomi glanced out at the dark Chicago skyline glowing beneath the storm clouds. 20 years earlier she would have felt humiliation sitting under all these eyes. 20 years earlier moments like this made her stomach tighten. Made her question whether success could ever protect someone who looked like her. Not anymore. Now she simply observed people when they revealed themselves. Clyde shifted her weight impatiently. If you are unhappy with the service, there are available seats in business class. Several passengers reacted instantly to that sentence. Not because of the downgrade itself. Because of the implication underneath it. Naomi looked back at Claire slowly. You are trying very hard to move me out of this seat. Clyde's face tightened. I am trying to preserve comfort for everyone involved. Naomi leaned back calmly against the leather headrest. No. You are trying to preserve your version of who belongs here. The cabin went dead silent again. Melissa stood frozen near the galley entrance holding folded blankets against her chest. Daniel's professional mask slipped another inch. Clyde looked around suddenly aware that fewer passengers seemed to be standing with her now. People were watching differently. Thinking differently. The atmosphere inside first class no longer belonged to the crew. And for the first time since boarding, Claire Whitmore looked uncertain. The uncertainty on Claire Whitmore's face lasted only a moment before pride pushed its way back in. People like Claire rarely back down once witnesses appeared. They doubled down instead. The first-class cabin had become too public now, too exposed for graceful retreat. Every nearby passenger could feel it. The tension sat over the rows heavier than the storm clouds outside the aircraft windows. Daniel Mercer adjusted his tie and looked toward the galley as if calculating how quickly he could contain the situation before departure delays started attracting attention from the cockpit crew. Naomi Carter remained completely still in seat 2A. That stillness was beginning to bother them more than anger ever would have. Calm people forced others to reveal themselves first. Claire took a slow breath and stepped closer into Naomi's row again. We are trying to offer you options, she said, her voice clipped and overly controlled now. Most passengers appreciate flexibility. Naomi looked up at her. Most passengers are not being pressured to leave a seat they paid for. The businessman in row 3 lowered his newspaper completely. Across the aisle, the older white woman finally spoke for the first time. Her ticket already scanned, she said carefully. Why are we still doing this? Clyde gave a professional smile that no longer reached her eyes. Ma'am, there are details you may not be aware of. Naomi answered before the woman could respond. Neither are you apparently. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably after that line landed. Danielle quickly stepped forward again before the exchange escalated further. Miss Carter, perhaps we should continue this conversation privately near the galley. Naomi folded her boarding pass once and placed it calmly beside her water bottle. No. Daniel blinked slightly. He clearly was not used to hearing that word in first class. Excuse-me? Naomi's voice stayed even. If your employee was comfortable humiliating me publicly, then your explanation can happen publicly too. Silence spread through the cabin again. The teenager in the back stopped pretending to listen to music entirely now. Melissa Chen still stood near the galley entrance clutching folded blankets against her chest while trying not to look terrified. Clyde crossed her arms tighter. Nobody humiliated you. Naomi turned toward her slowly. You called me trash. Clyde immediately shook her head. That was taken out of context. Then explain the context. Clyde hesitated again. Tolon. The passengers noticed. Naomi noticed more. The cabin crew had started losing control not because Naomi raised her voice, but because Claire kept revealing cracks every time she spoke. Danielle glanced toward the cockpit door where a pilot briefly peeked out before disappearing again. Timmy was slipping away. Boarding should have been completed already. Instead, first class had become a pressure cooker wrapped in polished leather seats and soft lighting. Claire suddenly pointed toward Naomi's phone resting beside her seat. You have been recording us. Naomi looked down at the black screen. No, then why do you keep checking your messages? Naomi almost smiled at the desperation inside the question. Because I own a company. A younger white man near row 4 let out the smallest involuntary laugh before immediately hiding it behind a cough. Clyde's face reddened. There is no need for sarcasm. Naomi leaned back calmly. There is no need for profiling either. The word hit harder than anything before it. Profiling. Direct. Precise. Impossible to soften into misunderstanding. Danielle's entire posture stiffened. Around the cabin, several passengers exchanged glances that silently admitted the same thing. They all knew what this really was now. Nobody could hide behind confusion anymore. Clyde's voice sharpened. Instantly. You are making accusations. Naomi held her gaze. No, I am describing behavior. Melissa shifted slightly near the galley. Naomi noticed her eyes lower toward the floor immediately after Claire looked in her direction. Fair. Not guilt. Fair. The kind employees carried when they had already seen something happen before. Naomi recognized that too. Her phone vibrated once more beside her. Another message from Renee Lawson appeared on the screen. We found prior complaints involving flight attendant Claire Whitmore. Naomi read the message without reacting outwardly. A second message followed almost immediately. Similar descriptions. Premium cabin targeting. Naomi stared at the screen for 1 second longer before locking the phone again. Clyde caught the movement. Who exactly are you texting? Naomi looked back up slowly. People who pay attention. That answer unsettled Daniel immediately. Naomi saw it in the way his jaw tightened. Corporate instincts were beginning to wake up now. Clyde, however, pushed forward recklessly. This is exactly the behavior we are trained to monitor. The businessman in row 3 frowned. What behavior? Clyde turned toward him too quickly. Disruptive passenger conduct. Naomi's eyes narrowed slightly for the first time all evening. Not anger. Recognition. She had heard that phrase before too. Disruptive. Another polished word that magically appeared whenever certain passengers stopped accepting disrespect quietly. The older woman across the aisle looked directly at Claire now. She has not disrupted anything. Clyde forced another smile. With respect, ma'am, trained crew members are better equipped to assess these situations. The sentence landed badly. Naomi watched the mood inside the cabin shift another inch away from the crew. Clyde was no longer sounding authoritative. She was sounding defensive. Dangerous territory for someone depending entirely on perceived authority. Daniel stepped slightly closer to Naomi's seat and lowered his voice again. Miss Carter, if we cannot resolve this calmly, security may need to become involved before departure. There it was. The threat wrapped in polite language. Naomi looked at him carefully for several seconds before answering. Security for what exactly? Daniel paused. Failure to comply with crew instructions. Naomi spoke softly enough that passengers leaned in to hear her. You mean refusing to surrender my seat because your employee decided I do not look wealthy enough to sit here? Nobody answered. Nobody could. The storm outside flashed briefly across the cabin windows, bathing first class in white light for half a second before darkness settled back over the runway. Naomi looked around slowly at the faces pretending not to stare. Some embarrassed. Some angry. Some ashamed. They stayed silent at first. Clyde shifted again under the weight of all those eyes. For the first time since boarding, her confidence looked fragile instead of sharp. Then Naomi spoke one sentence that changed the atmosphere inside the aircraft completely. Run my name through your executive database. Daniel's eyes flickered instantly. Clyde frowned. What? Naomi never looked away from them. You heard me. The moment Naomi Carter mentioned the executive database, the entire first-class cabin shifted again. Not loudly. Quietly. Like a crack spreading beneath glass. Danielle Mercer tried to hide the reaction first. Clyde Whitmore did not. Her face tightened immediately with irritation mixed against something more dangerous now. Uncertainty. The younger flight attendant Melissa Chan looked up so quickly she almost dropped the folded blankets in her arms. Several passengers exchanged glances that silently asked the same question. Who exactly was sitting in seat 2A? Danielle recovered fast enough to force another controlled smile. That will not be necessary. Naomi never blinked. Interesting answer. Clyde stepped forward before Daniel could continue. Passengers do not get to demand internal procedures. Naomi tilted her head slightly. And crew members do not get to profile paying customers. Yet here we are. The businessman in row 3 shifted deeper into his seat. He no longer looked annoyed. He looked uncomfortable. The older white woman across the aisle slowly folded her magazine closed entirely now, no longer pretending this situation belonged anywhere except directly in front of her. Rain rolled harder against the aircraft windows while the cabin lights reflected softly against polished armrests and champagne glasses. No one was drinking anymore. Somewhere farther back, the final boarding announcement echoed faintly through the main cabin. But first class remained frozen around seat 2A. Daniel lowered his voice again, the way executives did when panic started knocking beneath professionalism. Miss Carter, perhaps we should reset this conversation before misunderstandings continue. Naomi answered calmly. You keep calling it a misunderstanding because the truth sounds worse. Clyde crossed her arms tighter. The truth is that you escalated this. A soft voice interrupted from behind them. No, she did not. Everyone turned. Melissa Chen stood near the galley entrance gripping the blankets against her chest. Her voice shook slightly but her eyes stayed steady. Clyde stared at her in disbelief. Excuse me? Melissa swallowed hard. She has been calm the entire time. Danielle's jaw tightened instantly. Melissa. But the younger attendant kept going anyway. Her ticket scanned correctly at boarding. He saw it. Clyde's face flushed red beneath the cabin lights. You are not part of this conversation. Melissa looked down briefly before answering quietly, that is the problem. Silence slammed across first class again. Heavy. Immediate. Naomi watched the fear flicker across Melissa's face. Not fear of Naomi. Fear of speaking against people above her. That mattered. People only risk jobs when something finally felt too wrong to stay silent about. The Latina passenger 2 rows ahead lifted her phone higher now, no longer pretending she was not recording. Another passenger across the aisle did the same. Daniel noticed immediately. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced carefully, we ask that all electronic recording remain respectful toward crew members. The businessman in row 3 muttered under his breath, maybe crew members should act respectfully first. Clyde heard it. Her composure cracked another inch. This is unbelievable. Naomi finally reached for her water bottle again and took a slow sip before speaking. No. What is unbelievable is how comfortable you were until people started watching. Claire stepped closer to Naomi's seat. You do not know anything about me. Naomi looked up calmly. I know exactly enough. Danielle quickly moved between them before the exchange sharpened further. Everyone needs to lower the temperature here. Naomi's eyes shifted toward him. Temperature is not the issue. Accountability is. Melissa lowered the blankets onto an empty seat nearby with trembling hands. Naomi noticed the young attendant glance once toward Claire before speaking again. This is not the first complaint. Clyde snapped toward her immediately. Stop talking. But Melissa had already crossed the line fear usually prevented. Passengers have reported similar things before. Danielle's face changed instantly after that sentence. Not outrage. Recognition. Inu. Naomi caught it immediately. The purser knew there had been complaints already. Clyde saw it too. Those complaints were dismissed. Melissa answered softly, that does not mean they were wrong. The atmosphere inside first class changed completely after that. Until now, some passengers still wanted to believe this might have been isolated tension or personality conflict. Not anymore. Patterns changed everything. Patterns exposed systems. Naomi rested one hand lightly against the armrest while observing the cabin around her. She could almost feel the social balance tipping away from the crew now. Not because she demanded it. Because people were finally hearing enough truth out loud to stop lying to themselves. The older white woman across the aisle shook her head slowly. My daughter flies constantly for work, she said quietly. She talks about this exact thing happening. Clyde laughed once without humor. Of course. Naomi looked directly at her. That reaction right there. That is the problem. Daniel rubbed a hand briefly across his jaw before turning toward Claire. Perhaps we should pause this conversation until after takeoff. Naomi answered immediately. No, Daniel looked exhausted now. Miss Carter, you do not get to delay accountability until it becomes convenient. Several passengers nodded quietly after that sentence. Clyde looked around the cabin and realized too late that the room had changed sides. She was no longer standing inside authority. She was standing inside exposure. The teenager in the back whispered something to his mother who nodded grimly without taking her eyes off Claire. The Latina passenger lowered her phone briefly and asked softly toward Naomi, do you want this posted? Naomi looked at her for a moment. Then she shook her head once. Not yet. The woman frowned slightly. Why not? Naomi's voice stayed calm enough that everyone nearby heard every word clearly. Because viral is easy. Truth is harder. That sentence hit the cabin differently. Even Daniel looked momentarily stunned by it. Clyde, however, looked trapped. She had spent the last 20 minutes building a version of Naomi that depended entirely on disruption, aggression, or fraud. But Naomi refused to become any of those things. Instead she remained composed while the people around her slowly awakened on their own. That was what frightened Claire most. The truth was spreading without Naomi forcing it. Daniel finally exhaled and reached toward the tablet tucked beneath his arm. "Fine," he said quietly. "Let us verify the executive database." Clyde turned toward him sharply. "Daniel." But he was already typing. And for the first time since boarding began, Claire Whitmore looked afraid. Daniel Mercer stared down at the tablet in his hands while the first-class cabin waited in complete silence. The soft glow from the screen reflected against his face as his fingers moved carefully across the airline's internal system. Clyde Whitmore stood beside him rigid as glass, arms crossed tightly enough to hide the trembling beginning in her hands. Melissa Chen remained near the galley entrance with her eyes lowered, but Naomi Carter noticed the younger flight attendant watching Daniel from the corner of her vision. Everyone was watching him now. The businessman in row 3 leaned forward slightly. The older white woman across the aisle held her breath behind pressed lips. Even the teenager farther back had stood halfway into the aisle pretending to reach for a backpack just to see better. Outside the aircraft windows, rainwater streamed down the glass beneath the blinking runway lights while thunder rolled faintly over Chicago. Inside first class, nobody cared about the weather anymore. Daniel's expression shifted once. Fast. Teeny. But Naomi caught it immediately. Recognition. His eyes flickered upward toward her before dropping back to the tablet again. Clyde saw it too. "What is it?" she asked quietly. Daniel did not answer right away. That silence told the cabin everything before he spoke. Naomi remained seated calmly with one hand resting against the armrest while people around her slowly realized they were no longer watching a difficult passenger defend herself. They were watching authority collapse in real time. Clyde stepped closer toward Daniel. "What did you find?" Daniel finally looked up. "Miss Carter appears in the executive registry." The sentence landed across first class like sudden pressure loss. The businessman in row 3 blinked hard. The older woman's eyes widened. Melissa shut her eyes briefly as if relief and fear had collided inside her at the same time. Clyde stared at Daniel. "That does not mean anything." But her voice had changed now. "Less certain. Less sharp." Daniel swallowed once before continuing carefully. "She has executive-level clearance attached to her profile." No one spoke for several seconds after that. Naomi simply watched the cabin absorb it piece by piece. Clyde shook her head immediately. "There has to be some mistake." Naomi finally spoke again, her tone calm enough to feel colder than anger. "Interesting. Suddenly the system matters again." The businessman in row 3 let out a quiet breath through his nose while another passenger muttered softly, "Well." Daniel lowered the tablet slightly. "Miss Carter, if there has been any discomfort," Naomi interrupted without raising her voice. Discomfort. That single word stopped him instantly. Clyde looked cornered now, but instead of retreating she hardened again the way frightened people sometimes did when the truth arrived too fast. Executive clearance does not explain why she behaved suspiciously. Several. Passengers reacted immediately to that sentence. Naomi noticed the older white woman visibly recoil. The businessman stared directly at Claire now with open disbelief. Melissa looked down toward the floor again, ashamed on behalf of her own crew. Naomi tilted her head slightly. "Suspicious because I am black or suspicious because I did not wear diamonds?" Clyde's face flushed deep red. "That is not what I said." "It is exactly what you implied." Daniel stepped in quickly again. "Everyone needs to take a breath." Naomi looked directly at him. "I have been breathing calmly this entire time." Another silence followed. Heavy. Sir. Clyde's authority had started dissolving completely now, and she knew it. People were no longer looking at Naomi like a problem passenger. They were looking at Claire like evidence. The Latina woman recording from 2 rows ahead lowered her phone briefly and whispered under her breath, "This is insane." Naomi heard it. So did Daniel. Clyde suddenly turned toward Melissa. "You should go finish boarding checks." Melissa did not move. No, Claire blinked in disbelief. "Excuse-me?" Melissa looked terrified saying it, but she held her ground anyway. "I think I should stay." Naomi noticed several passengers suddenly straighten after hearing that. Weaknesses matter. Once one person found courage, others usually followed. Daniel rubbed a hand across his forehead. The polished control he carried earlier was disappearing now beneath exhaustion and panic. "Clyde," he said quietly, "perhaps we should apologize and move forward." Clyde turned toward him so fast several passengers jumped slightly. Apologize for what? The entire cabin froze again. Naomi watched Daniel realize in real time that Claire still did not understand the problem. She thought this was about procedure. About conflict management. About being challenged publicly. But it was deeper than that. The issue was never the seat. It was the assumption behind the seat. Naomi folded her hands together calmly. "That right there is why this keeps happening." Clyde laughed once in frustration. "You are turning this into something bigger than it is." Naomi looked around the cabin slowly. Before answering. "No. It was already big. People just stay quiet long enough for you to believe it is normal." The older woman across the aisle nodded silently after hearing that. The businessman in row 3 finally spoke again. "Honestly, she is right." Clyde stared at him. "You do not even know her." He answered immediately. "I know what I saw." That sentence shifted the room permanently. Clyde's face changed because she finally understood the worst part of losing authority in public. It was not the embarrassment. It was watching neutral people stop believing you. Daniel glanced down at the tablet once more, then back toward Naomi carefully. "Miss Carter, I was not aware of your position within the company." Naomi answered softly. "And if I was not connected to the company?" Daniel had no response ready. Neither did Claire. Because the question destroyed the last safe excuse remaining. Naomi leaned back against the seat and looked directly at Daniel while thunder flashed faintly outside the windows again. "You should not need a title to receive basic dignity on your own airline." Nobody in first class spoke after that. Even Claire stayed silent. Because for the first time since boarding began, the truth inside cabin 2A sounded too clear to argue with. The cabin remained frozen in the silence after Naomi Carter's last sentence. Even the low hum of the aircraft engine seemed quieter now beneath the weight hanging over first class. Clyde Whitmore stood beside Daniel Mercer with her shoulders stiff and her expression unraveling inch by inch under dozens of watching eyes. Passengers were no longer avoiding the situation. They were studying it openly now, like people finally seeing something they recognized but had never wanted to name out loud before. Naomi sat motionless in seat 2A with her hands folded calmly in her lap while rain continued sliding down the windows beside her. Outside, runway lights blurred gold through the storm. Inside, the atmosphere had turned electric. Daniel looked down briefly at the tablet again before lowering it completely against his side. His corporate voice returned, but weaker this time. "Miss Carter, I believe we can resolve this professionally." Naomi answered softly. "Professionally would have been greeting me with respect when I boarded." Clyde let out a breath through her nose and shook her head like she still could not believe the cabin had turned against her this quickly. "You are acting like we committed some terrible offense." Naomi looked directly at her. "You decided I did not belong here before I even sat down." Clyde immediately pushed back. "That is not true." Melissa Chen spoke quietly from the galley entrance. Claire snapped toward her instantly. Stay out of this. But Melissa did not lower her eyes this time. I cannot. That one sentence shifted something deeper inside the cabin. Naomi noticed it immediately. Melissa was no longer just nervous. She was tired. Tired in the way employees became tired after watching the same behavior happen repeatedly while everyone higher up pretended not to notice. Danielle looked toward Melissa carefully. What are you trying to say? Melissa hesitated only a second before speaking. I have seen passengers treated differently before. Clyde laughed sharply. Here we go. Melissa swallowed hard. Especially when they do not fit the image some crew members expect in first class. No one moved after that. The businessman in row 3 leaned back slowly while the older woman across the aisle closed her eyes for a brief moment, like hearing the truth spoken out loud exhausted her. Clyde looked around the cabin and realized she was losing the room completely now. That realization made her dangerous. So now everyone is accusing me of racism, she said loudly enough for several rows farther back to hear. Naomi remained calm. No. We are describing patterns. Clyde's voice sharpened instantly. You do not know me. Naomi answered without hesitation. You told me exactly who you were the moment you called me trash. The word hit the cabin all over again. Passengers shifted visibly. A younger man near row 4 muttered, she really said that? The Latina woman recording quietly nodded without lowering her phone. Daniel rubbed his jaw slowly as though the entire aircraft had suddenly become too small around him. Clyde, he said. Carefully, perhaps you should step into the galley for a moment. But Claire did not move. Breathing had trapped her now. The more exposed she felt, the more aggressively she clung to authority. No, she answered. Because suddenly I am the villain for doing my job. Naomi looked at her steadily. Your job is customer service. Not deciding who looks wealthy enough to deserve respect. The businessman in row 3 nodded immediately after that sentence. Exactly. Another passenger added quietly, she has been calm this whole time. Clyde looked stunned hearing passengers openly challenge her now. The social balance inside first class had completely reversed. Naomi did not need to demand support anymore. The cabin itself was beginning to speak. Danielle glanced toward the cockpit door where another crew member briefly appeared, sensed the tension, then disappeared again without saying a word. The line notifications would already be reaching operations by now. Somebody on the ground would soon ask questions. Naomi knew that. Danielle knew it too. Clyde crossed her arms tighter. Fine, she said coldly. If everyone thinks I am so terrible, maybe we should ask why someone with executive clearance boards wearing sneakers and a sweater like this. The sentence landed badly. Very badly. Naomi watched the realization spread across nearby faces in real time. Clyde had finally stopped hiding the assumption underneath everything. The older white woman looked horrified. Melissa stared at the floor in disbelief. Even Daniel closed his eyes briefly like he wanted to disappear from the cabin entirely. Naomi leaned back slowly against the leather seat. There it is. Clyde blinked. What? Naomi's voice stayed calm enough to feel almost painful. The real issue. Nobody interrupted now. Nobody defended Claire anymore. She had stepped fully into the truth herself. Naomi looked around the cabin at the watching faces before speaking again. You saw a black woman dressed comfortably and decided luxury could not belong to her. Clyde opened her mouth immediately. That is not what then what exactly did my clothes have to do with this? Clyde stopped. Because there was no safe. Answer left anymore. Sander flashed faintly outside the windows again while rain streaked silver across the dark glass beside Naomi's seat. The aircraft lights flickered softly overhead before stabilizing. Melissa finally stepped farther into the aisle, her voice trembling slightly. Claire has made comments before. Danielle turned sharply toward her. Melissa. But she kept going anyway. About passengers not looking first class enough. The cabin went completely silent. Clyde's face drained of color. Naomi watched Daniel realize the situation was now beyond public embarrassment. This was liability. Documentation. Witnesses. Patterns. The businessman in row 3 slowly pulled out his phone. Another passenger did the same. Clyde noticed and immediately panicked. You cannot record crew members. Naomi looked toward the passengers calmly. Do not post anything yet. Several people paused after hearing her. The Latina woman lowered her phone slightly. Why are you protecting them? Naomi answered without looking away from Claire. I am not protecting them. Then she looked directly at Daniel Mercer and delivered the sentence that made the entire cabin stop breathing again. I am giving this airline one last chance to tell the truth itself. The silence after Naomi Carter's last sentence felt different from the earlier ones. Before it, the cabin had been tense. Now it felt exposed. Like every person inside first class suddenly understood they were witnessing something much larger than an argument over a seat. Daniel Mercer stood motionless in the aisle with the tablet hanging at his side while Claire Morris' confidence continued collapsing in slow motion under the weight of watching eyes. Passengers no longer looked uncertain. They looked disappointed. Some angry. Some ashamed they had stayed quiet during the first few minutes. Naomi sat calmly beside the rain-streaked window, her expression unreadable beneath the warm cabin lights. Outside, lightning flickered faintly beyond the runway. Inside, nobody moved. The Latina woman holding her phone lowered it slowly after Naomi asked the cabin not to post anything yet. Why? She asked again quietly. Naomi turned. Thou work here. Because once it becomes entertainment, people stop listening. The woman stared at her for a second before nodding slowly. Around the cabin, several passengers lowered their own phones too. Danielle noticed. So did Claire. The older white woman across the aisle folded her hands together and looked directly at Naomi for the first time without avoidance in her eyes. I am sorry, she said softly. Naomi gave a small nod. Thank you. Clyde immediately looked frustrated by the shift happening around her. Sympathy was moving toward Naomi now without effort. Respecto. Clyde's authority depended on controlling the emotional temperature inside the cabin, and that control was slipping away faster every second. This has gotten completely out of hand, Claire muttered. Naomi looked at her steadily. No. It finally became visible. Daniel closed his eyes briefly before speaking again. Miss Carter, perhaps we should contact ground operations and formally document the situation. Naomi's eyes stayed calm. You should have documented it the moment your employee insulted a passenger. Melissa Chen looked toward Daniel carefully. There should already be a complaint process. Daniel glanced toward her sharply. Melissa. But she did not stop this time. People submitted complaints before. Clyde laughed bitterly. And now suddenly everyone is pretending I am some monster. Naomi turned her head slightly toward the rain outside the window before answering. No one becomes this comfortable overnight. The sentence hit hard enough that even Daniel looked away for a moment. Clyde opened her mouth to respond, then stopped herself. Because somewhere beneath the anger, she knew Naomi was right. Prejudice was rarely impulsive. It became visible through repetition. Through habits. Through assumptions practiced so often they eventually sounded normal inside Simeone's own head. Naomi rested one hand lightly against the cold window beside her seat while thunder rolled softly in the distance. For a moment, her attention drifted somewhere far beyond Flight 221. 26 years earlier, Naomi had been 16 years old standing beside her mother inside a crowded airport lounge in Charlotte. Her mother wore a department store dress and carried a worn leather purse with broken stitching near the handle. Naomi remembered the receptionist glancing at them once before saying, "This area is reserved for premium travelers." Naomi's mother calmly showed the membership card. The woman behind the desk looked shocked. Not apologetic. Shocked. As if dignity had arrived wearing the wrong skin. Naomi remembered the way her mother smiled afterward in the parking garage despite the humiliation burning quietly in her eyes. "Never beg people to see your worth," her mother had told her while rain hit the windshield outside. "Make them confront what they already chose not to see." Naomi had carried those words into every boardroom, every acquisition, every billion-dollar negotiation of her adult life. And now here she was again. Another luxury space. Another person deciding who belonged before facts even entered the conversation. Only this time the entire cabin was watching the pattern unfold in real time. Danielle's voice pulled her gently back into the present. "Miss Carter?" Naomi blinked once and looked toward him again. Danielle studied her expression carefully now. "Less defensive. More uncertain. I think everyone here understands mistakes were made." Naomi answered quietly. "Mistakes or accidents." Clyde looked immediately offended again. "So now I am intentionally racist?" Naomi did not raise her voice. "I think you became comfortable deciding who deserved grace." That sentence silenced Claire more effectively than any accusation could have. Melissa lowered her eyes again, but Naomi noticed the younger attendant nod once almost invisibly. The businessman in row 3 leaned back and sighed heavily. "Honestly," he muttered, "this whole thing feels bigger than one flight attendant." Naomi looked toward him briefly. "Because it is." Several passengers exchanged glances after hearing that. The realization spread slowly through the cabin. This was not about one rude comment anymore. It was about systems. About patterns people quietly accepted because confronting them felt uncomfortable. Clyde shook her head again, but the certainty was gone from her face now. "I treat everyone the same." Naomi looked directly at her. "That is what people say when they stop noticing the difference." Another silence settled over first class. Deep. Reflective. The kind that forced people inward instead of outward. Rain continued sliding down the windows while the aircraft lights glowed softly against polished surfaces and untouched drinks. Melissa finally stepped farther into the aisle beside Daniel. "I almost stayed quiet," she admitted softly. Naomi looked toward her. Melissa swallowed hard before continuing. "Because I did not want trouble." Naomi nodded once. "That is how these things survive." Nobody interrupted her. Nobody could. Daniel looked down toward the airline tablet again, then slowly back toward Naomi. "Ground operations is requesting a delay explanation," he said carefully. Naomi's expression never changed. "Tell them the cabin needed honesty before takeoff." The businessman in row 3 let out a quiet breath while the older woman across the aisle shook her head slowly as if she would remember this flight for years. Clyde stood alone now. Not physically. Socially. The cabin had stopped protecting her certainty. And for the first time since boarding began, Naomi Carter was no longer the only calm person in first class. The atmosphere inside first class had changed so completely that even the flight crew seemed unsure how to move through it anymore. What started as quiet humiliation had become something heavier now. Reflective. Dangerous in a different way. Passengers were no longer simply witnessing a confrontation between a flight attendant and a passenger. They were watching an institution being forced to look directly at itself. Danielle Mercer stood motionless near seat 2A while the rain outside continued washing silver lines across the aircraft windows. Claire Whitmore remained rigid beside him, her face pale beneath the cabin lights, but Naomi Carter noticed something new inside her expression now. Not just fear. Calculation. Clyde was searching desperately for a way to regain control of the narrative before the situation slipped fully beyond recovery. Naomi remained calm in her seat, her phone resting face down beside the untouched water bottle. Around the cabin, passengers sat quieter than before, as though nobody wanted to interrupt the truth unfolding in front of them. The older white woman across the aisle looked exhausted emotionally, like someone revisiting memories she wished society had already outgrown. The businessman in row 3 rubbed one hand across his chin while staring out at the storm beyond the glass. Melissa Chen stood closer now, no longer hiding behind the galley entrance. That mattered too. Witnesses always moved physically closer once fear started losing its grip. Daniel finally broke the silence. Ground operations is asking whether we are preparing for departure. Naomi looked up at him. Are we? Daniel hesitated. The question sounded simple, but it carried something larger underneath it now. Accountability delayed flights. Trust cost time. Airlines headed both. Clyde suddenly stepped forward again before Daniel could answer. This entire situation is becoming ridiculous, she said sharply. We have apologized. Naomi looked at her calmly. No. You tried to contain it. The sentence landed instantly. Several passengers nodded without speaking. Clyde looked around the cabin and realized people were no longer willing to protect comfortable lies. So what exactly do you want? She asked. Naomi's expression never changed. Honesty. Clyde laughed bitterly under her breath. That is easy to say when everyone suddenly decides you are the victim. Naomi tilted her head slightly. Suddenly? Clyde opened her mouth, then stopped again. Because every sentence she spoke now seemed to expose more than defend. Melissa glanced briefly toward Naomi before quietly speaking again. People complained because they felt humiliated. Clyde snapped immediately. You were not even here for all those flights. Melissa swallowed hard. No. But I heard the conversations afterward. Daniel closed his eyes briefly again, the exhaustion showing more clearly now. Naomi studied him carefully. It was beginning to understand the real danger was no longer public embarrassment. It was documented culture. Patterns. Witnesses. History. Her phone vibrated. Once against the armrest beside her. Naomi glanced down. A secure message from Renee Lawson appeared instantly. Executive Operations monitoring flight status now. Naomi unlocked the phone slowly beneath the soft cabin lights. Another message followed immediately. Internal review team located prior passenger reports involving Claire Whitmore and Daniel Mercer. Naomi read the message without outward reaction, but something colder settled behind her eyes. Daniel noticed anyway. Everything all right? He asked carefully. Naomi locked the screen again. That depends. Clyde folded her arms tighter. More mysterious executive messages? Naomi looked directly at her. No. Used patterns becoming records. The businessman in row 3 looked toward Naomi immediately after that sentence. There are actual complaints? Naomi answered calmly. Enough for concern. Clyde's face changed instantly. Concern from who exactly? Naomi leaned back against the leather seat while thunder rolled softly outside. People who care whether customers feel human on their own airline. Daniel's jaw tightened. The wording caught him. Own airline. Not this airline. Own airline. Melissa noticed it too. So did the older woman across the aisle whose eyes widened slightly before narrowing with realization. Clyde, however, seemed too defensive to catch the shift yet. This is unbelievable, she muttered again. Naomi looked toward the rain streaking down the windows. That word keeps appearing every time reality stops being convenient. Silence followed again. The aircraft lights dimmed slightly as boarding officially completed. Somewhere beyond the cockpit, a muffled announcement from gate staff echoed faintly through the terminal windows. First class remained trapped in its own suspended moment. Daniel finally spoke lower this time. Miss Carter, if there is executive concern regarding service culture, then perhaps there are formal channels better suited for this conversation. Naomi turned toward him slowly. Formal channels already received complaints. Daniel's expression tightened immediately. Melissa looked down toward the floor again. Clyde stared at Naomi. You investigated me? Naomi answered carefully. No, I investigated the airline. That hit differently. Because suddenly Claire understood she might not have singled out a random passenger at all. The realization spread across her face slowly, like someone hearing distant thunder too late. The businessman in row 3 leaned forward slightly. Wait, he said quietly, who exactly are you? Naomi did not answer right away. Instead she looked around the cabin at the watching faces. Some curious. Some nervous. Some finally beginning to connect pieces that had been sitting in front of them since boarding started. Melissa seemed to stop breathing entirely. Daniel looked almost afraid to ask the question himself now. Clyde forced a laugh that sounded thinner than paper. Apparently she is someone very important. Naomi settled on Claire calmly. Important enough that your behavior should concern you. Clyde swallowed hard for the first time all evening. The power dynamic inside first class had shifted so completely now that even the air felt different. Naomi picked up her phone slowly and typed 4 words to Renee Lawson. Activate Executive Flight Review. The response came almost immediately. Already initiated. Naomi placed the phone back down gently and looked toward Daniel Mercer. You should probably answer ground operations now. Daniel frowned slightly. Why? Naomi's voice stayed soft. Because several people on the ground are about to start asking why Flight 221 has not left the gate yet. Daniel Mercer stared at Naomi Carter for several long seconds after her last sentence before finally stepping away toward the galley with the airline tablet pressed tightly against his chest. The entire first-class cabin tracked him silently with their eyes. Nobody pretended to scroll phones anymore. Nobody cared about pre-departure drinks or weather delays or connecting flights. Something larger had taken over the aircraft. Clyde Whitmore remained standing near seat 2A, but the authority she carried earlier had almost completely evaporated now. She looked less like a confident flight attendant and more like someone realizing the walls around her were quietly closing in. Naomi sat calmly beside the rain-streaked window while thunder flashed faintly beyond the runway. Her expression remained unreadable, but inside the cabin the emotional gravity had shifted entirely toward her. Melissa Chen moved slowly into the aisle beside row 3, no longer hiding near the galley entrance. That alone told the story. Fear was leaving the witnesses one by one. Daniel disappeared briefly behind the curtain near the front galley, and within seconds muffled voices started bleating softly into the cabin. Ground operations. Dispatch. Somebody asking questions. Naomi glanced down at her phone as another secure message appeared from Renee Lawson. Executive Review Board joined emergency monitoring call. Naomi read it without reacting outwardly. Another message followed immediately after. Corporate legal requesting confirmation before escalation. Naomi locked the screen again. Clyde noticed the movement instantly. You keep texting like you own the place, she muttered bitterly. Naomi looked up at her calmly. Interesting choice of words. Clyde crossed her arms again, but even she no longer seemed convinced by her own posture. The businessman in row 3 finally spoke directly toward Naomi. I think everyone here deserves to know what is actually happening. Naomi met his eyes briefly. So on. The older woman across the aisle nodded slowly. I think we already know enough. Clyde turned toward the passengers sharply. You are all acting like she is some kind of saint. Naomi answered before anyone else could. No. They are reacting to behavior they watched happen themselves. Clyde shook her head. You twisted everything. Naomi tilted her head slightly. Did I twist the part where you called me trash? Silence crushed the cabin again. Clyde looked away first. That matter. Melissa noticed it too. Naomi could see the younger flight attendant studying Claire now with disappointment instead of fear. Daniel finally reappeared from the galley, but he looked completely different than he had 20 minutes earlier. The polished confidence was gone. His face had turned pale beneath the cabin lighting, and the tablet in his hands shook slightly before he steadied it. Again. The moment passengers saw his expression, the tension inside first class deepened instantly. Clyde stepped toward him. What did they say? Daniel looked at Naomi first before answering. Ground operations escalated the delay to executive response. Clyde frowned it. Why would executives care about a seating dispute? Nobody answered immediately. Naomi simply watched Daniel carefully while thunder rolled softly outside again. Daniel swallowed once before speaking lower this time. Because Miss Carter is attached to a restricted executive registry. The cabin went completely still. The businessman in row 3 slowly lowered his phone into his lap. The older woman across the aisle blinked twice like she had just connected every missing piece at once. Melissa's eyes widened immediately. Clyde laughed nervously under her breath. Restricted registry for what? Daniel looked exhausted now. Board-level access. The words landed heavier than anything said all evening. Clyde stared at him. What does that even mean? Naomi finally reached for her water bottle again and took a slow sip before answering herself. It means your airline recognizes me even when you refuse to. Clyde's face lost what little color remained. Around the cabin, passengers exchanged stunned looks while several people quietly whispered Naomi's name to themselves for the first time. Recognition was spreading now. Not everyone knew exactly who she was yet, but they understood enough to realize this situation had moved far beyond normal passenger complaints. Daniel took a careful breath. Miss Carter, he said quietly, ground executives are requesting direct communication. Naomi looked up at him. Already? Daniel nodded slowly. They were alerted the moment executive review protocol activated. Clyde turned sharply toward Naomi. You activated something? Naomi's expression never changed. No. Your behavior did. Another silence followed. Deep enough that the rain outside almost sounded loud against the windows now. Clyde looked around the cabin desperately searching for support, but none remained. Even the passengers who once avoided eye contact with Naomi were looking directly at Clyde now with open disappointment. Melissa stepped slightly closer toward Naomi's row. I am sorry, she said quietly. Naomi turned toward her gently. You spoke up. That matters. Melissa swallowed hard. I almost did not. Naomi nodded once. Most people almost do not. Daniel rubbed a hand across his face before holding out the tablet carefully toward Naomi. Executive Operations would like to speak with you directly. Naomi looked at the screen but did not take it yet. Instead she asked one calm question. Before or after the cabin hears the truth? Daniel froze. Clyde looked panicked immediately. This is insane. Naomi finally stood for the first time since boarding began. Slowly. Calmly. No dramatic movement. No raised voice. Yet the entire first-class cabin seemed to stop breathing anyway. Naomi adjusted the sleeve of her gray sweater once before looking around at the watching passengers, the frightened crew, the rain-soaked windows glowing under runway lights. Then she looked directly at Claire Whitmore. My name is Naomi Carter, she said softly. And I control the investment group currently finalizing majority ownership of Horizon Atlantic Airlines. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even thunder outside seemed distant suddenly. Clyde's mouth parted slightly but no words came out. Daniel lowered his eyes immediately. Melissa looked like she might cry from shock alone. The businessman in row 3 whispered one stunned sentence under his breath. Oh my God. Naomi's gaze never left Claire. You spent the last 40 minutes trying to remove me from a seat on an airline I am about to own. For several endless seconds after Naomi Carter revealed her identity, the entire first-class cabin stopped functioning like a normal place. Nobody reached for phones. Nobody adjusted seatbelts. Nobody even seemed to breathe correctly anymore. The storm outside continued flashing white across the windows, but inside the aircraft a different kind of electricity had taken over. Clyde Whitmore stood frozen beside seat 2A with her mouth slightly open and her arms no longer crossed. The confidence she carried earlier had vanished completely now, stripped away by one sentence. Delivered without anger, without shouting, without performance. Daniel Mercer lowered his eyes toward the floor while Melissa Chen stared at Naomi in stunned silence. The businessman in row 3 leaned back slowly like his body suddenly needed support beneath the weight of what he had just witnessed. The older white woman across the aisle pressed one hand lightly against her chest. "Oh dear God," she whispered softly. Naomi remained standing calmly beside her seat in the same gray sweater and white sneakers Claire had judged less than an hour earlier. Nothing about her appearance had changed. Only the truth around it had. Clyde finally found her voice again, but it sounded fragile now. "You are serious?" Naomi looked directly at her. "Very." Daniel cleared his throat carefully. "Miss Carter's investment group currently controls 38% of Horizon Atlantic's acquisition structure." Several passengers exchanged stunned looks after hearing the number out loud. 38%. Not symbolic ownership. Power. Real power. Clyde shook her head once as if trying to wake herself from a nightmare. "Nobody told us." Naomi answered softly. "That is usually how prejudice works. It acts before information arrives." Silence settled heavily across the cabin again. The sentence hit harder now because every person on board understood exactly what she meant. Clyde looked around desperately at the passengers who earlier avoided eye contact with Naomi. Now those same passengers looked back at Claire with expressions ranging from disbelief to disappointment. Melissa slowly stepped farther into the aisle. "You were evaluating the airline?" Naomi nodded once. "Customer culture. Executive behavior. Service integrity." Daniel closed his eyes briefly. The realization visibly crushed him. Every decision he made during the last 40 minutes suddenly transformed from bad conflict management into a catastrophic executive failure. Naomi watched him carefully. Unlike Clyde, Daniel at least understood the gravity now. Clyde still looked trapped somewhere between embarrassment and denial. "You should have told us who you were," she muttered weakly. Naomi's expression hardened slightly for the first time all evening. "Why?" Clyde blinked. Naomi continued calmly. "Would basic dignity only matter if you knew I had money?" Nobody answered her. Nobody could. The businessman in row 3 slowly shook his head under his breath. "That is the whole point," he murmured quietly. The older woman across the aisle looked directly at Claire. "You treated her like she was disposable." Clyde immediately looked defensive again. "I was following instincts." Naomi answered instantly. "Exactly." An utter silence spread through first class. The truth no longer needed explanation anymore. It sat fully exposed in the aisle between them. Daniel's tablet suddenly chimed loudly in the quiet cabin. He glanced down at the screen and immediately straightened his posture. "Executive operations requesting immediate live connection," he said carefully. Naomi nodded once. "Put it on speaker." Clyde's eyes widened. "Speaker?" Daniel hesitated only briefly before obeying. A calm female voice filled the cabin through the tablet speaker. "This is Renee Lawson from Executive Operations. Am I speaking with Miss Naomi Carter?" Naomi answered quietly. "You are." Several passengers visibly reacted hearing the formal tone immediately. This was no misunderstanding anymore. No exaggeration. No social media performance. This was corporate reality unfolding in real time 30,000 feet below the clouds before the plane had even left the gate. René's voice remained composed but urgent. The board has been informed regarding the incident on board Flight 221. Clyde lowered her eyes immediately. Daniel looked physically ill now. Naomi glanced once around the cabin before asking calmly, and their response? There was a brief pause before René answered. Full review authorization has been approved. Flight crew accounts are currently being suspended pending investigation. The words landed like thunder through first class. Clyde's head snapped upward instantly. What? Daniel looked down at the floor completely defeated now. Melissa covered her mouth softly with one hand. The businessman in row 3 whispered, "Well." René continued speaking through the tablet. Corporate legal and passenger relations teams are preparing immediate statements once documentation is finalized. Clyde shook her head rapidly. This is insane. Over one misunderstanding? Naomi's eyes locked onto hers immediately. You still keep calling it that? Clyde looked genuinely panicked now. Because I did not know who you were. Naomi stepped one pace closer into the aisle. Calm. Controlled. But every word landed sharper now. And that is exactly why this matters. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. The entire cabin listened. Naomi looked around slowly at every watching face before continuing. You gave respect conditions. Build. Appearance. Status. Recognition. Clyde's eyes filled with tears she clearly did not expect. I am not racist. Naomi answered quietly. Racism is not always loud hatred. Sometimes it is simply deciding who deserves patience before they even speak. The cabin went completely still again. Even René remained silent through the speaker. Melissa lowered her head slowly, emotional now for reasons bigger than one flight. The older woman across the aisle wiped at one eye discreetly. Daniel finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Miss Carter. I am deeply sorry. Naomi turned toward him. I believe you are sorry now. That sentence hit him visibly harder than shouting would have. Clyde stared at Naomi helplessly. What happens now? Naomi looked out briefly toward the rain sliding down the dark window beside seat 2A before answering. Now your airline decides whether this moment becomes accountability, or another buried complaint passengers whisper about for years. The silence after Naomi Carter's final sentence lingered through the first-class cabin like smoke after a fire. Nobody seemed willing to move too quickly anymore. Even the soft engine hum beneath the aircraft floor felt distant compared to the weight sitting between the rows. Claire Whitmore stood motionless near seat 2A with tears collecting in her eyes she clearly did not know how to control. Daniel Mercer held the airline tablet against his chest like it suddenly weighed 50 pounds. Melissa Chen remained beside the aisle with one hand pressed lightly against her mouth while passengers throughout first class watched the entire moment unfold with stunned stillness. Outside, rain continued washing over the aircraft windows beneath the flashing runway lights of Chicago ORA. Inside, something irreversible had already happened. René Lauson's calm voice still echoed softly through the tablet speaker. Miss Carter, corporate legal is requesting immediate procedural direction. Naomi remained standing beside her seat, composed as ever beneath the warm cabin lights. She glanced slowly around the cabin before answering. No public statement yet. Several passengers exchanged surprised looks after hearing that. The businessman in row 3 frowned slightly. You are not going public with this? Naomi turned toward him calmly. I am more interested in whether the company changes than whether the internet gets angry for 24 hours. The older white woman across the aisle nodded slowly to herself after hearing that. Claire looked downward toward the carpet, unable to meet Johnny's eyes anymore. René spoke again through the speaker. Understood. However, executive review protocol requires immediate operational response. Naomi's gaze shifted toward Daniel Mercer first. Then start there. Daniel swallowed hard. Miss Carter, Renee's voice interrupted before he could continue. Daniel Mercer, your executive flight credentials have been temporarily suspended pending investigation. Daniel froze completely. The color drained from his face while several passengers inhaled sharply around the cabin. The tablet chimed once more. Claire Whitmore, Renee continued calmly, your active crew status has also been suspended effective immediately. Clyde looked up so fast the movement startled Melissa beside her. What? Her voice cracked apart beneath panic. Renee remained professional. You are relieved from all active flight duties until formal review concludes. Clyde shook her head rapidly. You cannot do this because of one complaint. Naomi answered softly before Renee could speak again. It was never one complaint. That sentence settled heavily across first class. Melissa lowered her eyes immediately. Daniel looked physically exhausted now, like years of ignored problems had suddenly arrived all at once demanding payment. Clyde stared at Naomi helplessly. Please, she whispered quietly, I did not know. Naomi's expression stayed calm but colder now. You keep saying that like it would excuse what happened. Clyde wiped quickly beneath her eyes. No, I just. He thought, Naomi waited. Clyde could not finish the sentence because everyone in the cabin already knew how it ended. He thought you did not belong here. The silence that followed exposed the unfinished truth more clearly than words ever could. The businessman in row 3 leaned back slowly. That is the part people never say out loud, he murmured quietly. Naomi looked toward Claire carefully. You made assumptions before facts. Before a names. Before a humanity. Clyde finally looked directly at her again. I am sorry. Naomi studied her for several seconds. The apology sounded real now. Not because Claire feared consequences. Because for the first time she truly understood what she had done. That mattered. But it did not erase anything. Naomi glanced toward Melissa. And you? Melissa looked startled. Me. Naomi nodded once. Why did you speak up? Melissa swallowed hard before answering honestly. Because I was tired of pretending not to notice. Naomi's eyes softened slightly for the first time all evening. That honesty probably protected more people than you realize. Melissa looked emotional hearing that. Renee's voice returned through the speaker again. Miss Carter, ground operations also confirmed additional passenger complaints involving premium cabin profiling across multiple routes. Naomi closed her eyes briefly. Not surprised. Just disappointed. Daniel lowered his head completely now. We failed, he admitted quietly. Naomi looked toward him. You ignored warning signs because the complaints were inconvenient. Daniel nodded once without arguing. The older woman across the aisle finally spoke again. That happens everywhere, she said softly. Hotels. Stores. Airports. People decide who belongs before opening their mouths. Several passengers nodded silently after hearing that. The atmosphere inside first class had transformed completely now. Earlier the cabin felt divided. Defensive. Suspicious. Now it felt reflective. Uneased in a way uncomfortable spaces rarely became unless truth forced its way in. Claire took one shaky breath. What happens to us? Naomi looked directly at her. That depends on whether this airline learns something from tonight. Renee spoke carefully through the tablet. The board has requested your presence at emergency review tomorrow morning. Naomi nodded once. I will be there. Then she added calmly, and so will the passenger reports everyone buried. Daniel closed his eyes briefly again while Claire looked like she might collapse under the emotional weight surrounding her. But Naomi's tone never turned cruel. That was the part several passengers noticed most. She had every reason to humiliate the people who humiliated her. Yet she never chased revenge. Only accountability. The businessman in row 3 finally spoke directly toward Naomi again. Most people would destroy them publicly after this. Naomi looked toward the rain sliding across the dark window beside seat 2A. Public shame changes headlines, she said quietly. Then she looked back toward the cabin. Real accountability changes culture. Nobody spoke after that. Ibn Renee remained silent through the speaker for a moment. The aircraft lights dimmed softly as gate crews prepared the delayed departure sequence outside. Somewhere beyond the terminal windows, another plane lifted into the stormy night sky. Naomi slowly sat back down into seat 2A while the first-class cabin remained completely silent around her. But this time the silence no longer felt cruel. It felt humbled. 37 minutes later, Flight 221 finally pushed back from the gate beneath a sky still heavy with rain. The first-class cabin looked completely different now, though almost nothing physical had changed. The same leather seats remained. The same amber lighting glowed softly overhead. The same polished windows reflected streaks of runway light across the dark glass. But the emotional atmosphere had transformed entirely. Earlier the cabin carried tension, suspicion, and silence sharpened by prejudice. Now it carried reflection, humility, awareness. Naomi Carter sat quietly in seat 2A beside the window while the aircraft slowly taxied across the wet tarmac. Clyde Whitmore and Daniel Mercer were gone from active cabin duty, escorted discreetly off the aircraft 20 minutes earlier after replacement crew arrived from the terminal. There had been no dramatic scene. No public humiliation. Naomi insisted on that herself. Do not turn accountability into spectacle, she had told executive operations before the crew change began. Melissa Chin now moved carefully through first class alongside a senior replacement purser named Elena Ruiz, whose calm professionalism immediately changed the energy on board. Passengers responded differently too. Softer voices. More eye contact. More humanity. The businessman in row 3 had introduced himself during the delay. His name was Richard Hale, a software consultant from Denver traveling to New York for a conference. The older white woman across the aisle was named Judith. She had quietly thanked Naomi again before takeoff, her eyes carrying the weight of memories much older than this flight alone. Eben, the Latina woman who recorded earlier, eventually approached Naomi before departure. I never posted the video, she said softly. Naomi nodded once. Thank you. The woman hesitated before asking, do you think things will actually change? Naomi looked out the rain-covered window for a moment before answering. Only if people stop treating dignity like a reward. The woman sat back down afterward without another word. Those sentences stayed with people. Naomi could feel it. As the aircraft turned toward the runway, Melissa approached seat 2A carefully holding a fresh glass of water with both hands. Miss Carter? Naomi looked up. Melissa smiled nervously. I just wanted to personally thank you. Naomi accepted the glass gently. For what? Melissa glanced down briefly before answering. For saying things out loud that most people are too afraid to say. Naomi studied the younger woman carefully. Melissa reminded her of herself years ago, intelligent, observant, trying to survive systems that quietly trained people to ignore uncomfortable truths. Courage spreads, Naomi said softly. That is why silence matters so much. Melissa nodded slowly. I almost stayed silent. Naomi's expression softened slightly. But you did not. Melissa swallowed hard before stepping away down the aisle. Outside the window, runway lights stretched endlessly through the storm like blurred gold lines disappearing into darkness. The engines deepened beneath the cabin floor as the aircraft prepared for takeoff clearance. Naomi leaned her head lightly against the seat and finally allowed herself one slow breath. Not relief. Reflection. She thought again about her mother standing in that airport lounge 26 years earlier holding a membership card nobody believed belonged to her. She remembered the shame in her motors as mixed with the dignity she refused to surrender. Back then Naomi believed success would eventually protect her from moments like this. Billion-dollar companies. Magazine covers. Executive power. Private meetings with senators and CEOs. Yet tonight proved something deeper. Prejudice did not always disappear when black women became powerful. Sometimes it simply waited until power dressed casually enough to become unrecognizable again. The plane paused briefly at the edge of the runway while lightning flashed far beyond the airport skyline. In seated first class, passengers sat unusually quiet, as though nobody wanted to break whatever understanding had formed between strangers during the delay. Richard finally spoke softly from row 3. "You could have destroyed that airline tonight." Naomi turned slightly toward him. "No," she answered calmly. "I could have embarrassed it." Richard frowned thoughtfully. "There is a difference?" Naomi nodded once. "Embarrassment disappears after headlines fade. Culture does not." Judith across the aisle listened silently before adding her own quiet thought. "People always think racism has to look dramatic." Naomi looked toward her gently. Judith shook her head slowly. "Most of the time it looks exactly like tonight. Assumptions. Tone. Suspicion. Little things repeated long enough to become normal." Naomi gave a small nod. "That is why people miss it." The aircraft finally received clearance for departure. Engines roared louder beneath the cabin as Flight 221 accelerated down the rain-soaked runway. Passengers instinctively pressed back into their seats while city lights blurred outside the windows. Naomi watched Chicago disappear beneath the storm clouds below them. Somewhere beyond the darkness ahead waited another boardroom, another investigation, another long conversation about culture and accountability and the dangerous comfort of unchecked assumptions. But for now there was only the steady climb into the night sky and the silence surrounding C2A. Not hostile silence anymore. Respectful silence. The kind people carried after witnessing something they knew would stay with them long after landing. Naomi closed her eyes briefly as the aircraft pierced through the clouds. Then she opened them again and looked out across the endless dark horizon beyond the wing. Her voice came softly enough that only the nearest passengers heard it clearly. "The dangerous thing about prejudice," she said quietly, "is how confident it sounds before the truth arrives." Nobody answered her. They did not need to. Because somewhere above the storm clouds over Chicago, an entire cabin already understood.